Autumn wind drifted through the narrow streets of Asheboro, North Carolina, carrying the scent of dry leaves and the soft chime of a wind bell hanging from a porch nearby. Elena Martinez walked slowly along the cracked sidewalk, her hands tucked into the pockets of a long coat. A beige scarf was wrapped tightly around her lower face. A couple passed by, and the man gave her a brief glance before quickly looking away. She didn't blame him, she was used to that look. It had become as familiar to her as the boots on her feet, worn out and barely noticeable anymore. The little bookstore where she worked closed at 6 sharp. The owner, a man in his 60s with tired eyes and a kind soul, never asked questions. He didn't stare. He never brought up the scarf or the faded scars that peeked out from beneath her sleeves. Each evening, he simply nodded and said, "Sleep well, Miss Martinez." And she would nod back with, "You too, sir." No more. No less. The wooden staircase to her attic apartment creaked beneath each careful step. The apartment itself was modest, barely over 100 square feet. It held a narrow bed, a desk, and a little electric stove near the window. She flicked on the light and the room warmed in a soft yellow hue. She hung her coat, washed her hands, dried them, and sat down beside the window with a hot mug of tea. Outside, the town moved at its usual unhurried pace. No one noticed the woman in the attic sipping tea in silence. Elena slowly peeled off her gloves. Her fingers were narrow, the skin along them mapped with scars like rivers across a desert. She turned her hands under the lamp and gently rubbed in a layer of cream. In the cooler months, the skin cracked painfully. This, too, was ritual, not for vanity, but to remind herself that pain meant she was still alive. On the desk sat a small wooden box. Inside it were folded letters, aged and softened at the edges. She opened one, brief, typed in a shaky font. It was from Jake, an old teammate from Kandahar. "If it weren't for you, I wouldn't have made it home to see my daughter. Forever grateful." She smiled faintly, slid the letter back into the box. She never wrote him back. Never wrote anyone back. She simply held on to those scraps of memory the way someone might hold on to a dried flower from a war-torn field, quietly, privately. A mirror hung near the desk. Elena stood, pulled the chair closer, and sat before it. The reflection showed her scarf first, still in place. She raised her hand, paused for a moment, then began to slowly unwrap the fabric. The burned scars reached from her left cheek down to her jawline, raw, textured skin that told 1,000 stories. But her eyes, staring back, no longer flinched. No one ever told her that the worst scars aren't on your skin. They're in the way people hesitate to speak when you enter a room. In the uncomfortable silence at a restaurant table. In the uncertain tone when someone doesn't know whether to call you ma'am or miss. But they're also in the moments she remembered placing her hand on a dying soldier's chest, whispering, "You're gonna be okay." In the nights when her fingers, blistered and trembling, stitched wounds while mortars rained in the distance. She studied herself in the mirror, a woman approaching 40, with thoughtful eyes and a forehead lined with quiet grief. The face she saw was not the face she had before the war, but it was still hers. No one called her Sergeant Martinez anymore. And maybe that was fine. Because tonight, it was enough to recognize herself, not through someone else's gaze, but her own. Elena looked into the mirror, unwrapped the scarf from her face, and let a faint smile cross her lips, as if to say, "This is acceptance." The past came flooding in, her final mission in Kandahar, where Elena saved 7 American soldiers during a brutal attack. The face in the mirror, scars and all, was the last thing she remembered before the sky turned to fire and her world split open. That day hadn't begun with warning. It never did. There were no sirens, no grand gestures from the universe to say, "This will be the moment that breaks you." Just the smell of antiseptic, the dry hum of desert air, and the low murmur of pain from soldiers lined up on cots inside the medical tent. Elena was tending to a young corporal's shrapnel wound when the first round hit. The blast rattled the ground, jolted her off balance. Dust and sand spilled in from the seams of the tent as distant gunfire cracked open the air. A second explosion landed closer, much closer. The wall behind her burst outward. Metal fragments and flame tore through the canvas like paper. There wasn't time to think. She ducked instinctively, pulled the corporal down with her. Her ears rang. The screams began almost immediately, loud, disoriented, human. She grabbed her kit and crawled toward the nearest voice. Outside, chaos. Smoke curled in the wind, thick with burning oil and melted metal. The sky had turned into a dirty canvas of ash. Gunfire stitched through the air, distant but creeping closer. Elena kept low, knees scraping rock, one hand pressed to a bleeding soldier's neck. He was barely conscious. "Stay with me," she murmured. "You're not going down here." Another blast, this one knocked her flat. Her helmet rolled away. Heat blistered her cheek. She couldn't hear anymore, just a dull underwater throb. Still, she moved. Adrenaline and duty were stronger than pain. She pulled one man, then another, dragging them behind a blown-out truck. Blood soaked her sleeves. Her gloved hand stuck to a wound like glue. Somewhere, someone was yelling her name. She didn't stop. Jake Carter appeared out of the smoke, limping, face streaked with grime. "Martinez. You're hit." She looked at her arm, barely registering the burns, but waved him off. "He needs morphine." "You got it." They worked in tandem, no time for words. One soldier's leg was gone from the knee down. Another had a collapsed lung. Elena kept moving, patch, press, drag, repeat. She lost count of how many she pulled from the wreckage. Time bent. Hours or minutes, she couldn't say. It wasn't until the final blast that the wall came down. Concrete and steel folded inward, collapsing in a roar. Elena shoved a younger private ahead of her, throwing him forward just before the ceiling caved. A steel beam caught her shoulder. Something cracked, bone or brick, she couldn't tell. Dust swallowed everything. And then, stillness. Under the rubble, her hand clutched the arm of the soldier she'd just saved. Her body pinned, mouth filled with grit, she lay with her eyes open, refusing to close them. Refusing to go out like that. Somewhere behind the ringing in her ears, she imagined the wind from home, the creak of the bookstore stairs, the scent of her morning tea. She hung on to those small things, anchors in a storm she hadn't asked for. By the time the rescue team dug her out, her uniform was soaked in blood, not just hers, but the lives she wouldn't let go of. The photo the army used later showed her being lifted onto a stretcher, her face half burned, her eyes still alert, jaw clenched tight. The caption beneath it read, "Sergeant Elena Martinez, decorated for valor." Elena was awarded the Medal of Honor, but chose to leave the military after the psychological trauma. Elena stepped into the new coffee shop, just a small reward to herself after a long shift. The door gave a soft chime as she entered, and warm air brushed past her scarf-wrapped face. The place smelled of cinnamon syrup and ground espresso. Industrial lighting cast a mellow gold over polished concrete floors and steel stools lined up at the bar. It was the kind of place designed to feel effortlessly cool, succulents in tiny pots, music soft but hip, young faces glowing behind laptop screens. She hesitated. Her boots made faint clicks against the tile as she walked to the counter. The barista, a boy who couldn't have been older than 20, didn't make eye contact. He tapped on the tablet. "What can I get started for you?" "Chamomile tea, please." He didn't speak. Just tapped the screen again and turned the tablet around for payment. She signed with a gloved finger, stepped aside. The scarf stayed in place. It always did in public, even if it drew more stares than it prevented. Her heart beat faster than usual. Strange, considering she'd once carried wounded men through fire. But this space of normal life, was the kind of battlefield she never learned to navigate. She spotted an empty table by the window and made her way there, careful not to brush too close to the other patrons. She kept her head low, focused on the tea in her hands. 3 voices behind her, laughing, sharp, young. She could feel their eyes before they said anything. A girl whispered too loudly, "Oh my God, did you see that?" A phone camera clicked. Another chuckled, she's like a Halloween extra. Elena didn't move. She held the cup tighter. Her hands stayed still, but her breath shortened. The voices weren't meant to be subtle. They never were. One of them leaned in closer to their phone, angled it toward her, whispered, #Scarface sightings, and pressed post. The silence in the rest of the shop was louder than the laughter. No one said anything. No one stopped them. A woman near the bar frowned, but quickly looked away. A man in a booth buried his face deeper into his screen. Everyone chose distance. No one chose her. Then came the line that cut through it all like a blade, "Halloween came early this year, huh?" The laugh that followed was uglier than the words. Elena closed her eyes for half a second. Her tea had gone lukewarm in her hand. She stood slowly, willing her fingers not to shake. She wasn't going to cry. She wasn't going to let them have that. The manager came over, polite but tight-lipped. "Ma'am, we try to keep the environment comfortable for everyone. Maybe it's best if..." He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Elena nodded. She reached for her bag, her movements measured. Her shoulder brushed the doorframe as she turned toward the exit. And just then, as her hand reached the handle, someone behind her stepped forward. A firm hand rested gently on her shoulder. The stranger turned out to be Officer Jake Carter, a Marine who once fought beside her in Kandahar. His hand was firm but gentle on her shoulder, grounding her like an anchor thrown into stormy seas. She turned, slowly, her eyes narrowing beneath the scarf. For a split second, she didn't recognize him, not here, not in this clean, polished cafe where the only thing sharp was someone's tongue. "Jake?" Her voice cracked. He nodded. His face was older, but the lines were familiar, etched by sun and smoke, not time alone. "It's really you," he said quietly. Then, louder, clearer, "This woman is a hero." The words cut through the coffee shop like a siren. Conversations stalled. Cups clinked awkwardly. One of the teenagers holding the phone froze, his smile faltering. Jake stepped forward. "You kids think this is funny? You think mocking someone's scars is entertainment?" He turned to the others now listening. Elena Martinez served in Kandahar. She pulled 7 men out of a firestorm while half her body was burning. "Including me." Silence swelled. The kind of silence that doesn't know where to go next. The girl with the phone lowered it, muttered, "I didn't know." "You didn't care to know," Jake replied, his voice low but sharp. "But now you do." One of the others mumbled, "Let's go," and they shuffled out in a hurry, faces red. Jake didn't look back. Elena stood frozen. She hadn't moved since hearing her name out loud in that voice. That place. It unlocked something she had pressed down for years. "Come on," he said gently. "Let's get some air." They stepped outside. The sun had started its slow descent behind the town's low roofs, painting the sidewalk in soft gold. Cars hummed past. The autumn breeze tugged at her scarf, and for once, she didn't fix it right away. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded, still silent. He leaned against a lamp-post. "I heard about you getting out. Didn't think I'd ever run into you in a coffee shop of all places." "I didn't expect to be rescued," she said, lips tugging into a faint smile. "Again." He chuckled, the sound easing something tight in her chest. "I didn't rescue you in Kandahar. You dragged me out. I was bleeding like hell, you were half on fire, and you still had the nerve to bark orders." She looked away, not out of shame, but disbelief. "Feels like another life." Jake folded his arms. "Doesn't mean it didn't happen." They stood there a while, the sounds of town wrapping around them. She didn't know what to say, but he didn't press her. Instead, he watched her quietly, like someone who'd seen a storm pass through and was grateful the house still stood. Then he said, "Elena, you don't need to bow your head. You saved lives. Mine. Others. Those people in there, they don't deserve your silence." She looked up at him. The sunlight hit his uniform badge just so. Something in her shifted. He pushed away from the post, preparing to leave. Before he turned, he glanced back once, voice calm but firm. Sometimes, heroes need to remind the world who they were. It started small, just a few hundred views by the end of that first night. But by morning, the numbers were climbing like wildfire. Someone had clipped the moment Jake said she pulled 7 men out of a firestorm and slowed it down, overlaying dramatic music and grainy footage of Kandahar. A local news anchor called her the face of quiet courage. Another headline read, "Coffee shop cruelty silenced by Marine heroism." Elena sat in her apartment, the blue light of her phone screen flickering against her face. A new notification buzzed every 10 seconds. People from all over the country, some anonymous, some former military, were leaving comments. "Ma'am, I don't know you, but I respect you. My brother had burns too. He never let the world see. You're braver than most. Thank you for your service. I hope you know you're not invisible." She read them in silence. Her thumb hovered over the reply button more than once, but she never pressed send. On her kitchen table lay a stack of unopened letters, handwritten, slid under her door or mailed to the bookstore. One was from a woman in her 70s who had lost a husband in Afghanistan. Another from a teenager with a birthmark on her face who wrote, "I saw you and thought, maybe it's okay to be seen." And yet, with every kind word came a knot in her chest. She hadn't asked for this. She never wanted the world's gaze, only its peace. Her laptop pinged with a new email. "We'd love to have you on our morning segment. Viewers are inspired by your strength." It came from a major news outlet. A second one followed from a podcast titled Faces of Valor. A third, local radio, less flashy, more heartfelt. Each message seemed to ask, "Will you speak?" She closed the laptop. The following afternoon, walking down Main Street for groceries, a young man looked up from his bike and slowed. "Miss Martinez?" he asked softly. She nodded. He didn't push for more, just nodded back, respectful. Down the block, someone left a bouquet by the bookstore door with a note, "We see you. Thank you." The world was remembering her. But that came with its own weight. She had spent years building a quiet life, one step at a time, each day stitched together by small routines, tea, books, long walks, no eyes watching. Now, the eyes had returned, and she wasn't sure they saw her, or the image they had built of her. Her phone buzzed again. A text from Jake. "Jake Carter, they'll move on to something else next week. But this moment, it's yours, if you want it." A pause. Then, "If you need to disappear, I understand. If you want to stand up, I'm here." That night, she stood in front of her mirror again. This time, she didn't reach for the scarf. Her reflection stared back, scarred, solemn, strong. She didn't look away. She didn't flinch. Her hands stayed by her side. Her breath stayed steady. She didn't whisper anything poetic to herself. She just looked. Still, when the reporter knocked on her door the next morning, she didn't open it. The phone rang twice, she ignored it. An email offered to send a car. She clicked delete. Elena remained silent. The press kept calling, but she refused to speak. A group of Marines organized an event called Honoring the Silent Hero and invited Elena. She read the message twice. Then a third time. The invitation came as a letter, hand-delivered by Jake himself. He stood at her door, in civilian clothes, holding a simple white envelope. No camera crews, no fanfare. Just his voice saying, "You don't have to come. But I hope you will." She didn't answer right away. That afternoon, Elena sat at her table surrounded by the quiet. The invitation rested beside her teacup. Her scarf lay folded nearby. The walls of her apartment felt smaller than usual. Tighter. Like they were listening in. The words from the past few weeks swirled in her head, comments, letters, Jake's texts. And the little girl's message, "You made me feel proud of my scar." She hadn't asked to be anyone's symbol. But what if this wasn't about being a symbol? What if it was about not hiding anymore? That evening, just as the sun began to soften over the horizon, Elena stepped out of her apartment. She wore a long coat, boots polished, and a scarf, this time folded into her pocket, not wrapped around her face. The community center was modest, brick walls, wide windows, folding chairs set up in neat rows. About 50 people filled the room. No one wore suits. Some wore military uniforms, others jeans and cardigans. It wasn't formal. It was personal. Jake met her at the door, his expression unreadable at first, then softened by something like pride. "You came," he said simply. "I'm not here to give speeches," she replied. He smiled. "Then don't. Just stand where they can see you." As she entered, the room shifted. Not gasped. Not whispered. Just shifted. Like someone had opened a door in the back of the mind and let in fresh air. A few people straightened in their chairs. A man near the front put his hand over his heart. An older woman wiped at her eyes. Elena took a seat in the second row. The lights dimmed, and a slideshow began to play, images from Afghanistan, some taken during her deployment. A voice narrated stories of service, sacrifice, and moments that had no photos to prove they happened. Then came the first speaker, a corporal who had lost part of his leg in Kandahar. He spoke slowly, deliberately. "I only remember two things from that day, the pain, and her voice, telling me I'd make it." Another followed. Then a nurse who had worked beside her. One by one, they gave shape to pieces of her that even she had tried to forget. After the final speaker stepped down, Jake approached the front. "There's one more person we'd like to recognize tonight," he said. "She didn't want this. Still doesn't. But we want to thank her, for what she did then, and for walking in here tonight." Elena sat frozen. Then a small hand tugged gently at her coat. She turned. A girl, maybe 8, freckles on her cheeks, hair in 2 braids, stood holding a folded note. "This is for you," she whispered. Elena opened it. The handwriting was careful and large. "I have a scar on my neck and I always cover it. But now I think it's part of my story. Thank you for being brave. I want to be like you." Elena folded the note gently. Stood. Walked slowly toward the front. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She reached into her pocket and took out the scarf. Held it in her hands for a moment. Then, in front of everyone, she let it fall to the podium. And turned to face them all, her whole face, her real skin, the lines of war and time etched without apology. It was folded neatly, the paper worn soft along the creases. Elena sat at her kitchen table, a single lamp casting a quiet pool of light around her. Outside, the town had settled into its nighttime hush, no engines, no voices, just the occasional breeze slipping through the window cracks. She unfolded the letter slowly, as if disturbing something sacred. "If anyone remembers me," it began, "please remember what I did, not what I look like." She had written it with shaking hands in the hospital bed after Kandahar. Her arm had still been wrapped in gauze, her face barely recognizable even to herself. The words had spilled out like a plea, desperate to control what remained of her story before the world rewrote it. Now, years later, she read it aloud, only to herself, but with clarity. The room didn't echo. The silence listened. She took a deep breath. Then picked up a pen. Beneath her old words, she began to write. "And I will also learn to remember who I am, even if the shape of that person has changed." She paused, the pen hovering midair. Outside the window, headlights passed slowly down Main Street, casting a shifting shadow across her wall. In the quiet, her mind wandered, not to the battlefield this time, but to the faces of the men she had saved. Some still sent her birthday cards. Some, she would never hear from again. But tonight, she didn't see them as ghosts. She saw them how they used to be, laughing over cold rations, grumbling about sandstorms, teasing her for being too serious. In her mind's eye, they weren't dying. They were alive, sitting across the table from her, hands cupped around invisible mugs of coffee. One of them, the youngest, barely out of high school, grinned and said, "Took you long enough, Sarge." She smiled back, quietly. The folded scarf sat nearby, untouched. She hadn't worn it in days. She looked down at the letter again. It wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. It was honest. And for the first time, she didn't feel the urge to tuck it away. Instead, she placed it flat on the table, where it could breathe. Where it could be seen. The air felt lighter somehow, like the weight on her chest had shifted. Not gone. But no longer pressing. Her phone buzzed with a new message. She didn't reach for it. Instead, she walked to the small mirror on the wall. The same one from the first night. This time, she didn't look at what had changed. She looked at what had remained. Her eyes. Her voice. Her will. The sound of applause echoed in her mind, not the polite kind, but the kind that rises without warning, from people who finally understand. And in that imagined moment, she could almost see them, Jake, the others, the girl with the braids, the crowd that stood for her not because she was perfect, but because she had stood it all. Elena began appearing as a guest at trauma recovery circles and community talks about healing. Not because she sought a platform. But because, slowly, people had started asking not who she was, but how she kept going. That question, she realized, was worth answering. She sat on stage in a small auditorium, folding chairs, paper cups, low ceilings. The kind of space that smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and shared memory. The host introduced her not as a hero, but as a woman who had walked through fire and kept walking. Elena took the microphone. Her voice was calm. Clear. After I left the service, I thought I had left myself behind too. I didn't recognize the person in the mirror. And I was afraid, not of pain, but of being forgotten by the world I had once fought for. A quiet murmuring of agreement rippled through the room. She continued. For a long time, I didn't want to be seen. I thought if people saw the scars, they'd stop looking at me. But I've learned, sometimes being seen is the beginning of healing. Down in the front row, a woman, mid-50s, eyes brimming, lifted a trembling hand. I covered half my face for 10 years, she said, voice breaking. I've never said that out loud before. Elena nodded gently. Then today, we say it together. The woman sobbed openly. Someone offered her a tissue. And then, without cue or command, the room stood and applauded. Not the kind of clapping reserved for celebrities or orators, but for something raw, shared, and brave. Later that evening, Elena walked alone along Main Street. It was cool and quiet. Her coat fluttered slightly in the breeze. She passed the bookstore, now closed for the night. And just past it, the coffee shop. She hesitated. Then opened the door. The same barista from weeks ago stood behind the counter. His eyes met hers for half a second, then dropped. No words. No smile. But no smirk either. She ordered chamomile tea. When she turned to wait, a girl, college-aged, backpack slung over one shoulder, stood behind her in line. Hey, the girl said, voice soft but steady. I saw your video. The one with the Marine. That moment stayed with me. Elena blinked. She hadn't expected to be recognized again. Not here. Not now. Thank you for staying, the girl added. A lot of people would have disappeared. But you didn't. Elena turned fully, meeting the girl's eyes. And for the first time in years, her voice didn't waver. Thank you, she said. For seeing me. She picked up her tea, stepped back into the evening air. The wind carried a few dry leaves down the sidewalk, rustling gently along her path. And as she walked, her face uncovered, people passed her by, some smiling, some simply nodding. No one stared. No one turned away. They greeted her not with pity, but with recognition. She no longer covered her face when walking through town, because now, when people looked, they didn't see a scar. They saw her.